Hi everyone, Azo here again, and welcome to the third part of the Smith-Morra Gambit crash course. If you haven't seen the previous two parts yet, I'll put them into a playlist along with this video and leave a link to that in the video description. In those videos, I covered common tactical themes as well as the general development scheme for white's pieces. To recap, after black accepts the gambit, so long as he continues soundly, the placement of the rest of your pieces are pretty much fixed, with the exception of your dark square bishop. Depending on how the game pans out, your bishop will belong on either e3, f4 or g5. And that's exactly what I'll be covering in this video, how you go about deciding the best bishop move. So without further ado, let's begin. More often than not, the best square for your bishop is f4. The reason is simple, it controls the most squares, and we have actually already seen some examples of that in part 2 of this video series. We saw the game between Milan Matulovic and Bratvarovich Alexander, where the combination of bishop f4 and the temporary knight d5 sacrifice put black in a very passive position, which was enough for white to win. Additionally, in that same video, you may also recall a line where I was discussing the knight b5 tactical motive, and there bishop f4 was essential in not only supporting the key e5 break, but also forcing black to accept this sacrifice on b5 so that our light square bishop can attack from b5 safely. So those were some recaps, and now I'd like to add a fresh example of how bishop f4 can be helpful, and that is combating knight c6 to e5. Let's look at a game between Gran Shui and Patrick Wolf. Here, black's moves already reveal his true intention. He's delaying e6 to put his bishop outside the pawn chain on g4. And interestingly, bishop g4 could not have been played any sooner because of tactical reasons. As we have seen in the first video of this mini-series, knight f6 is necessary to overprotect the bishop on g4. Otherwise, bishop takes f7, followed by knight g5 comes, and the bishop hangs. And knight c6 is also necessary. If black played the way he did, without knight c6, white would have bishop takes f7, followed by knight e5, hitting the bishop twice, and this knight can't be taken because the queen is unprotected. And finally, a6 is necessary to watch over b5. Otherwise, comes e5, and even if the queen's off, white's initiative is too powerful thanks to knight b5. So really, this is as fast as black can make bishop g4 work. When that happens, white can expect bishop takes f3, and after the queen recaptures, black will have knight e5, getting the bishop pair back and trading two sets of minor pieces in the process, which takes away quite a bit of white's dynamic counterplay. So with that, we know that queen e2, if played now, would be a waste of time since it will be recapturing on f3 shortly. And this also means that the f1 rook has to wait for the queen to vacate d1. This leaves white with two possibilities: stopping bishop g4 with h3, or developing the dark square bishop. h3 is alright, but it's a little slow given that white wants to play energetically, consistent with the nature of the Smith-Morra Gambit. So now, it's just a matter of where to put the dark square bishop. Since the threat is bishop f3, followed by knight e5, white's best move is to take care of that with bishop to f4. And that was played in the game. And sure enough, the game continued with bishop g4. White played h3, which is no longer considered a slow move now that it comes with tempo. After the trade on f3, black could still try to trade a second pair of pieces with knight e5, but allowing the bishop takes e5 trade is not the same as a fork to pick up the light square bishop on c4. First of all, the light square bishop is more valuable than his counterpart thanks to the vulnerable f7 target. Moreover, the d file will be fully open, making white's task of punishing black's poor development much easier. And I can show you a line to demonstrate all of this. white should of course go rook f to d1, and there's no point in black's queen moving to the c file, only to be booted by the other rook shortly, so queen to b8. And here you could go rook a to c1 to follow up with a familiar idea, bishop b5 or knight b5, but there's a more direct way. If you'd like to, you can pause the video and try to find it. The best move is knight d5, preventing e6 or g6 since f6 would hang. So, knight takes d5, and here, white would love to play bishop takes d5 and follow up with queen b3, killing black on the light squares. However, black has e6 just in the nick of time to kick the bishop off this diagonal before queen b3 can be played. Therefore, white should prepare the plan with queen to b3 first. The knight is not going anywhere, thanks to the pin to checkmate. Yet another advantage of having the d file fully open for our rook. So instead, black could try to stop bishop takes d5 with e6, but that allows us to capture on d5 with our pawn. In other lines, we wouldn't want to take with our pawn, because that's the square our bishop wants to use. But in this case, because black has already played e6, which was necessary to stop bishop d5, we can now take on d5 with the pawn, knowing that there will be a pawn trade here, which will vacate the d5 square for our bishop shortly. Let me show you what I mean. If black takes on d5, we'll get our ideal coordination. Otherwise, if he plays any other move, we know that we can capture on e6 to vacate the d5 square. And on top of that, we can abuse the a2 g8 diagonal. So, now that we know knight e5 loses by force, let's look at what happened in the game. Black played e6, which is the only way to bring the dark square bishop out. If g6, white will go rook f to d1, pinning the d6 pawn and threatening e5. And after the queen moves, there's bishop takes d6, taking advantage of the temporarily unprotected knight. So, e6, and white continued with the typical plan, rook f d1, and black played queen to c7. As I mentioned, I prefer queen b8 to queen c7 because it gets out of the way of rook a to c1, which happened in the game. After bishop to b3, the threat of knight d5 forced the black queen back to b8. And then came knight to a4, and it's tough to suggest a move to cover the b6 square. The b pawn can't move because c6 hangs, and knight d7 can be met with queen to g3, again showing one of the key purposes of bishop f4, to attack d6. In the game, black had to move his queen back to c7, but that didn't stop white from owning the b6 square. As far as the opening is concerned, white certainly got ample compensation for the pawn. The rest of the game was back and forth, and it ended in a win for white. So, those are some of the points for bishop f4. Now let's consider situations where other bishop moves are preferable, starting with bishop to g5. So what good can a bishop on g5 bring? For one, when our bishop on f4 is chased with e5, d5 becomes especially weak. That is when bishop g5 does an excellent job eliminating the prime defender, the knight on f6. And what's worse is that after bishop takes knight, black can't even maintain his pawn structure because after bishop takes f6, d6 will hang. And just like that, our dark square bishop has singularly created two weaknesses, d5 and f5. Our knights are headed for those squares, and black's light square bishop can only choose to give itself up for one of them. Another situation, and actually one of the most common cases when the bishop belongs on g5, is when black's kingside knight develops to e7. Bishop f4 would then make no sense, since knight g6 would come with tempo. And normally, in the Smith-Morra Gambit, white should delay the development of the dark square bishop and wait for the position to clarify before committing the bishop to a square. But in this case, the position has already been defined. The bishop belongs on g5 to congest black's kingside development. And the only way for black to decongest is to play some preparatory moves and weaken its position slightly. If h6 were played, white can play knight to b5 to threaten knight d6 mate. There's a line that goes d5 and white gets the pawn back, and we reach an imbalanced position where black has the bishop pair and a slightly more active king, while white has better piece activity. There's some theoretical debate going on about the Smith-Morra, and this is certainly one of the positions to explore if you want to play the gambit in serious games. However, if black wants to hold on to the pawn, then he needs to play a6, then h6. And let's pause and take a moment to understand what has just happened. White has played bishop g5 back to e3, and black needed to play a6 and h6 to keep his pawn. So even though white has technically lost the tempo from this early bishop foray, that tempo was spent on either a6 or h6, both of which don't help black's position at all. In fact, these pawn moves simply create weaknesses. The g6 knight is now a little bit looser without the extra protection, which can be a problem when white goes e5 and reroutes the light square bishop to the b1 h7 diagonal. And also, a6 weakens the b6 square, and the bishop on e3 and the queenside knight can work towards that. In fact, we have seen that several times in this video series, and that brings me to my final point, and that is, the bishop, the dark square bishop, is best suited on e3 when a6 is already played, since b6 will be weakened. And with that, I'd like to end off with an exercise for you. In this position, what would you play as white? Pause the video to think about it. Alright, so quite clearly, it's between bishop e3 to go after b6 and bishop g5 to take on f6 and go knight d5. There aren't really any other options. So let's analyze bishop g5 first. It does make some sense to go after the d5 square by capturing the knight on f6. However, in the earlier example, our knight was on b5 rather than c3. This means when we now capture on f6, black doesn't have to take with the pawn, he can take with the bishop, since d6 is sufficiently protected. And overall, trading the dark square bishop for the knight is not terrible. However, even though white has the d5 square, black isn't any worse off. He's castled, his pawn structure is preserved, and since white can't really use the f5 square for a variety of reasons, black's light square bishop can give itself up for the knight on d5. And sure, you could try to have the knights converge on d5, but when that happens, black will have an outpost of his own. Compare that to bishop e3, where white can very quickly go after the b6 outpost. b5 doesn't work, on pain of bishop takes bishop, followed by knight b6, and black is hanging an exchange and a piece. Black can also try to stop knight to b6 with knight to d7, but we very quickly force him into passivity by creating a weakness on e6 and abusing it. Now the only way to defend the pawn, is to go knight f8, but that allows knight to b6. And now we don't have the d5 square, but we have the comparable b6 square that allows us a clear plan of expanding on the queen side. Moreover, we have an e6 weakness, which our kingside knight is free to assault, thanks to our dark square bishop watching over the d4 outpost. So all in all, bishop e3 is a tad better than bishop g5. And with that, we come to the end of the entire mini-series on the Smith-Morra Gambit. To sum up the main points in this video, the bishop usually belongs on f4 because it serves the most purposes from there. It attacks c7 and d6, which can work very well with knight to b5. It supports the key e5 break and deters knight c6 to e5. Other times, when a6 is already played, the bishop might belong on e3, where it can control b6 with the help of knight a4. It could be developing the e3 from its starting square, or it could be a retreating move when evicted from f4 or g5. Alternatively, when black has already went e5, the bishop can go to g5, trade itself for the f6 knight to gain further control over the d5 square. Finally, when black develops the kingside knight to e7, the bishop nearly always belongs on g5 to provoke a6 and h6 before retreating to e3 to, again, use the b6 square. So that's all from me. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.